Well, back in the old days, which is really like the 1920s, 1930s, they said, well, that's a rational thing, of course, right? And we all know what that means. We had all these theories coming up back then, rational choice theory, game theory, these Maximin models, and all that kind of stuff, which says how you should ideally and rationally make your decisions, and said like, okay, you have these and these options, then you apply certain rules to that, and then you calculate everything, and then in the end you know what is the best decision, you know. But and actually back in the old days, they were really of the opinion that we would actually always be making decisions like that, you know. That was like the hidden mechanism with which we do all the decisions in our everyday lives. But of course, with just a little second of insight, you can see that that is not the case, right? When I have a decision to make, I do not just go down to the table and start calculating all my odds and probabilities, you know? I just do it more out of the stomach. So criticism started in the 50s onto this very rational model. And a couple of scientists came up who said that actually humans in complex situations are neither willing nor able to calculate all the time, right? You don't go down to the table, calculate all your odds in front of every decision. So what they rather do is they use some sort of shortcut strategies to decide. They don't do this full-fledged rational game theory stuff. They use other strategies, you know. They don't have time and they have to find some quick way, so okay. And how does this go? That's a process they called heuristic decision-making. Tversky and Kahneman were two scientists, I think economists, and they were very famous for finding out how actual decisions are being made. Their landmark paper is 1975, and they got the Nobel Prize for that in 2005. And they said, well, in actual decisions, we're working kind of heuristic, right? The heuristic is some reduced framework where you highlight some perspectives and leave some other perspectives out of sight to get a clearer picture of what you want to do in a certain aspect. And we're actually not working with this full kind of rationality. We're working with a reduced rationality, right? We judge situations causally. We use our everyday knowledge. We don't check every fact, right? We don't look into science every time we have to make a decision on what to buy or what to eat, right? Because in a rational world, that would be what you would have to do, you know? And then the depth of your investigation actually depends on how relevant it is for you. But usually, you don't bother for the most complete and correct information possible, right? I mean, everyday people, they just decide, well, they have heard this and they've heard that, and so, well, okay, I'm going to do this, you know. It's not so terribly important. I'm not going to check everything, so it's not a court case here. I've just decided like that. And in most cases, of course, you're not even capable of doing that. I mean, most people are no scientists, and they're not even very smart at gathering information. They don't have routines or methods to gather information, to analyze information, so they sort of have to rely on hearsay knowledge, right, on what people say and what they've heard and so on and so forth, and that's how they actually make their decisions, you know. They rely on a few facts of hearsay knowledge. Exception, of course, the hackers. The hackers are always very informed about everything. And what's even worse about that, we're not only having this reduced rationality that we're only deciding upon a reduced number of hearsay facts, we're also psychologically biased. That's the other thing they found out, Tversky and Kahneman in 1975, by looking at a lot of decisions and how people are making decisions. And the big bias number one is that you love your own values, you know, and your values are always getting into your decisions, right? But no, that's something the rational decision theory has never thought of. You know, rational decision theory said, we're doing this unemotionally, right? We're calculating all the odds, and game theory says this and that, and whatever the outcome is, that's what we're going to do. But of course, that's not the case, you know. You favor certain facts. You tend to memorize things in support of your own values much more than things which are not in support of your values. I mean, there could also be negative facts. If you remember all the things Schäuble said or did because you're opposed to what he does, then that, of course, is something you take to support your values, you know. So whatever you have as a hearsay knowledge already is biased from the beginning. What the basic set you have as a knowledge is already biased by the values you have. So there goes a tiny bit of that rationality idea. Then what you choose as relevant facts from what you hear Depends a lot on, as well on what you want to be relevant facts, right? If you have a preset opinion, what you want to know, what you don't want to know, then that's how you sort your facts, with which you're here in a certain decision situation. When somebody tells you, this and this and this, and consider this and this and that, then you just say, okay, well, I don't like this, but that I like, that I consider, and so that's how you sort what's relevant. And another thing that's also always very relevant is that the public opinion of your own cultural or subcultural group is very influential, right? Whatever the people say around you and how you, especially in particular the people who constitute your own societal values or represent those, that's the people which you're following in your decision making or in your knowledge and your values, because you don't want to stand outside. So your knowledge is already deeply biased by values. And then bias number two is that they're given this already very tendentious situation and almost irrational, or at least much less rational situation than anyone would have ever thought. There are some further characteristic effects which have been found in psychology, the psychology of decisions. The one is the anchor effect. I just mentioned three here. There are a bit more, but these three are the most relevant. The anchor effect, for instance, is very known to you. Everybody of you will know this thing. Very colorful and very recent facts are more present than other, right? What happened in the news yesterday and the thing that was printed in the big red letters, that is something which appears much more factual than anything you have heard last year in the FAZ with just a small kind of text thing. Then familiarity effect. Frequently heard facts appear to be more true and more frequent than others. That's a big problem, I believe, to our democracy in general, because the media, of course, they love the dramatic stories, and they love like stories about child pornography, or they love stories about terrorists bombing stuff. So whenever something like that happens, they actually run it over and over and over again, over weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And the best example is like private TV. When they get good footage from some amateur filmer of some strange thing happened, they show that like 5 times in a row in one news flash. It's really crazy. But because it's good material, it's dramatic, so it has to be repeated. People like that, people read that, so they're repeating it over and over, and you get the impression psychologically, without, of course, noticing rationally, that this is happening all the time, and that's a particular fact which is known with this child molester problematic. If you ask people how many children are actually murdered by perverts every year, they say something about, well, it must be 100 or something, but actually it's about 4 or 5, right, in the whole of Germany for 1 year. And that's precisely this shift we have in our perception, because that's the way we gather facts. And another effect is, I don't know if I translated that correctly, it's Repräsentativitätseffekt in Germany, representativeness effect. People are judged by the stereotype they are taken to represent, right? When you get news or when you get knowledge, gather knowledge, and there are certain people involved like who are in a certain stereotype, like lawyers, or politicians or whatever, or politicians of a certain party, then you already judge them by the stereotype you have of these particular people, right? You don't look into the particular profiles of these people, or you don't look very precisely at what they say, what they do, what their opinions are, because you think you already know them, but just by the stereotype they represent, right? So that's something that goes into there as well. So, well, uncertain decision-making, right? That's not a very rational thing. It's based on a reduced number of facts, mostly from your own hearsay knowledge. It's largely unchecked. It's favorably by use of facts which are in support of your opinion in the first place, which are very colorful, very recent, or simply heard a lot. And people appearing in your decisions generally appear as preset stereotypes. So that's really, I think that's a very different picture from what we usually have from decision making, when we think, oh, we're so smart, we're so rational, we're calculating the odds, and anyway we're finding the best decision, No, that's not the case, We're very biased, we're very psychologically determined in what we decide, and very irrational in a way. So, that was a bit of an excursion to decision theory. Now let's get back to surveillance. So I already said deciding on surveillance, how does that situation look? And I always said, back in the old days of avoidance, we could decide with certainty. When we are in a situation where surveillance is relevant for us, that's always like the action we have to consider here. When surveillance is relevant for us, how do we decide? And back in the old days, that was a decision with certainty, because I knew for sure that there was no surveillance, nobody had data, I could decide with certainty. But today, there's a decisions with deep uncertainty, actually. And especially now, these very days, there are decisions which are really difficult to make. Because there's a huge number of facts to consider, really. If you want to go into it and make an informed decision, I guess we here are experts, but I guess no one of you will be able to make a 100% informed decision about any surveillance-related situation, right? Because there are much too many facts to consider. You know, there are a lot of technological options, many of which are hidden, are secret, so even hard to know in general. And there are many potential surveillors with too many interests. You can't really look into them, what they're really after. You don't know how many agents are after you, how many commercial agents are surveilling your electronic behavior, what the state does with the information. Those are all things which you really don't have a full-fledged picture of, right? It's because it's very difficult. It's a very complex situation. So everything is too complex to understand in principle. Even for us as experts, I can't speak for myself. I couldn't claim I have an oversight over everything happening with my data when I make a phone call or when I'm on the internet. And if that holds for me already, then the situation must be much worse for any lay people, you know, for any technical lay people or anybody who's not an expert. You know, they really can't decide anything with the slightest bit of certainty. So, what does that mean when we go back to this decision theory thing, if we can't decide with certainty, but rather with a lot of uncertainty in surveillance-like situations? Well, public hearsay knowledge about surveillance will be very influential because I don't know all the real facts. I will remember all the facts that my friends have told me and the press has told me and all those, and that will be like the very basis upon which I decide. That will largely consist of what has been prominently in the press, of course, because what has been very colorful, what has been very loud, what has been repeated a lot. Then the general public opinion about surveillance will bias that knowledge even further, of course, also depending on the subculture I live in. And the public stereotypes of the involved agencies will be very relevant for the opinion and for the makeup of the whole knowledge. And what are those stereotypes? You know, that's lawyers, politicians, and all the big companies. So, well, so we can easily see that given this situation, some people will certainly not be informationally self-determined, and they will not be able to be informationally self-determined because they will not be able to have a sufficient factual or good knowledge preventing them from being suspicious about surveillance and preventing them from manipulating themselves in front of surveillance. People who possess a rather bad and skeptic hearsay knowledge about surveillance, which I believe is already a lot of people. People who have a bad or skeptic attitude towards it, which is you in particular. People who hear rather bad than good news about surveillance. And people who don't like the involved stereotypes, like the state, the big bosses, politicians, the police. The police still has good credibility in Germany, we have to acknowledge that. But generally, it always depends on the situation you're in and the agencies which you're trying to recognize or which you think you see behind that. So when you're in a situation like this, then you will not be very informationally self-determined because you will think that you will be manipulated in your knowledge, you will be manipulated in your decisions. And now we can ask ourselves, well, what about data protection? Now we have sort of set out the problem. These people will not have a very factual knowledge or anything, and this data protection help us now. This data protection provide us an anchor here, help us to get some certainty and a rational basis for decision, to regain that. Does it do that? And I would say no, certainly does not. You know, data protection is a complicated and huge judicial apparatus itself, and it adds to complexity and uncertainty. You know, if I'm uncertain or suspicious about what's happening with my stuff and I want to look at data protection, and I mean, have you looked up the web pages of those guys? They have like huge pamphlets and laws and complicated stuff, really awful to read, boring. So it's not helping really. It's not really giving you a rational basis or something you can rely on in your decision. And even the public facts they produce, the data protectors produce, are useless because they're still too much to read and it's hard to find them even. You know, they're not so very much in the press. as well. And